in the former Soviet Union, Yuri had been ordered to move to a minor position in the faraway place called Siberia. Of course, everyone knew that that was not a good place to go. And as he was packing to make his way there, his parents were in tears, and they said, please, please stay in touch. And Yuri, trying to calm his parents, he said, I'll write you every day. But the parents said, well, there's censorship. They'll watch every word you write. Yuri's father said, but I have an idea. Anything you write in black ink, we'll know it's true. But anything you put in red ink, we'll know it's nonsense. With that agreement, Yuri went on to Siberia. A long month passed, and finally a letter arrived, and it was all in black ink. Dear Mama and Papa, the letter began, I can't tell you how happy I am here. It's a worker's paradise. We're treated like kings. I live in a fine apartment, and the local butcher has meat every single day. There are many concerts, theaters, and movies, all free. And there is not one tiny bit of anti-Semitism. Love, your son Yuri. P.S. There is only one thing you can't find here in Siberia: red ink. In our text for today, Jesus said he had one purpose for coming into the world, and that was not to bear false witness, but to bear witness to the truth. And truth really is the topic of the day. It is Christ the King Sunday, and as Christ becomes King, then truth will truly become clear and evident. And I think that it's interesting that as we find Jesus here on trial before the Roman governor, he is there because lies have been told about him by the people who are God's representatives, the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, these religious leaders, God's spokespeople, were telling lies about Jesus to get rid of him. And Pilate, the pagan Roman, is the one looking for truth. He's trying to find what is true and what is not true. Truth is always a precious commodity, isn't it? In fact, Pilate ends this episode by saying, sort of sarcastically, well, what is truth? Almost to say, well, it really doesn't matter. What my decision is what the truth is in this and every matter. But truth always matters, doesn't it? In fact, in the next moments, we'll consider three characteristics of truth. First, that it is elusive. Second, that it is essential. But third, that truth has been and is embodied. But first, truth is indeed elusive. It is difficult to know what is true in today's world. If we think about it in our own experience, I remember back a number of years ago, probably as many of you do, hearing the outcome of the O.J. Simpson murder trial. I remember seeing half the nation celebrating in the streets and the other half of the nation shaking their heads and saying, what in the world is going on here? Is that jury made up of a bunch of morons? Can't they see the truth that's there? Evidently, those who were a part of the jury saw a truth that other folks didn't see as they watched the trial play out there on television. And complicating the problem is the fact that it's equally hard to know who to trust. There are very few people that we would refer to as heroes, those who are authority figures. It seems as if everyone has their own agenda, has their own spin doctors, their own spin masters. In fact, remind ourselves of those simple truths that we live in a world where Reverend Jesse Jackson and the former Reverend Jerry Falwell were both ordained Baptist ministers. And if you listen to each one of those, you would certainly get a far different version of what the truth is on just about every issue that you can imagine. And of course, just recently we've had in our country the idea of alternative facts being presented and in fact accepted as being reasonable by some people. And to make matters worse, there is more misinformation out nowadays. In fact, it was interesting to come across this a couple of months ago. Of course, we all are very much aware of the sad statistic that still pretty much holds true, that 1 out of every 2 marriages in America will end in divorce. And really, when you think about that, that's a horrible statistic, but really, it's not true at all. You go to the government figures and even the Lewis Harris Company that does the polling, and it came out with a report that said that really only 1 in 8 marriages end in divorce. In any single year, about 2% of existing marriages break up. But the misinformation comes from the fact that the Census bureaus do show that there are about 2.5 million marriages every year, and about 1.2 million marriages dissolve in divorce. And so you think, well, 2.5 and 1.2, well, that's almost 1 in 2. That sort of makes sense. But what Mr. Harris pointed out was a much bigger chunk of marriages, 53 million marriages, keep right on chugging along, just like Old Man River. So it is not true that half the marriages end. We get a lie and disinformation, and we say, well, does that really make that much of a difference? Well, it probably makes a difference, maybe to a young couple who's hit a rough spot, and they think, well, half the people fell at this, it's no big deal. Let's throw up our hands and move along. But wouldn't it be great if we had some type of truth detector that would let us know when people are being dishonest? Do you remember the story of Pinocchio? I think that's probably one of the best ones. When he told a lie, his nose got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it was obvious no matter what he was saying, because you could look at his nose and tell whether he was telling the truth or not. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have that as an option today on watching TV commercials or political debates or the local news coverage? In fact, the ancient Chinese had an interesting approach to discovering truth. They knew that when someone was experiencing fear or anxiety, that generally the secretion or the flow of saliva would shut down. And so what they had people to do when they were offering testimony, they would offer them a handful of dried rice to chew. And if the suspect could speak and then spit it out, they declared what he said to be honest. If he couldn't summon up enough saliva for this, they judged that he was fearful of or afraid of being discovered as telling a lie. Truth is elusive, but it is also essential. Can any relationship survive without trust? Trust is broken whenever one person in the relationship is not truthful with the other. Trust is something that's hard won, and it is sadly very easily lost. And once it is lost, it takes a great deal of time to get it back, if it ever comes back. And certainly society cannot stand and cannot long survive without this type of basic integrity. And we know that if the blue light ever shines in our rearview mirror, certainly our heart rate goes up. We're filled with anxiety. But can you imagine living in a country where you could not trust the officers who were pulling you over because you were breaking the traffic laws? Think of the terror that would exist if the police were just simply another set of thugs. Or the local pharmacist mixing drugs upon which our survival and health depend. Suppose the pharmacist decided to just simply dilute the drugs in order to make money by selling contraband out the back door. Or even in the restaurants where we eat, we expect there to be a certain level of sanitary conditions so the food that we eat will not give us disease. But what if that were not so? You know, when you question whether a little bit of cheating is a serious matter, or a little bit of untruth or stretching the truth, ask yourself how you would feel to live in a society where no one could be trusted. It certainly would not be a very pleasant existence. But truth is essential, even when the truth is not pleasant. In his book, The Different Drum, Scott Peck presents an interesting theory about relationships. He feels that God designed us and makes us yearn for open and honest and authentic relationships, what he refers to as communal relationships. But because we choose peacekeeping over truth-telling, we end up in what he refers to as a pseudo-community, a pseudo-communal relationships. They're marriages and family relationships and friendships that are all just on the surface level. No one ever dares to discuss anything that is deemed unsafe. They never discuss their misunderstandings or reveal their hurt feelings or air their frustrations or ask difficult questions. And the underlying rule in these pseudo-community is don't rock the boat, don't disturb the peace. But it's a counterfeit peace. Misunderstandings will always arise anytime you have more than one person. And if they're never resolved, then those things begin to fester. And it certainly does not build a strong sense of community. And that's something that should be found in every relationship. In fact, the only antidote to this pseudo-surface community is to tell the truth and to value the truth, because truth is essential to healthy relationships, and it's very essential to healthy religion. How often, if you reflect back in the pages of the New Testament, how often did Jesus cause a stir simply by standing up and telling the truth? He told the truth about the hypocrisy of the religious leaders of his day. In fact, it was his truth-telling that had him standing in front of Pilate there in our text. Jesus' truth-telling caused these religious leaders to be uncomfortable to the point where they made up lies about him. That's why it's always so refreshing to have children around, because they have a tendency to tell the truth, even when it's truth that we really don't want to hear, even when it's a truth that everybody else just sort of gasps. In fact, one dermatologist put it like this. He said, very often he has older people come into his office, newly minted grandparents, most of them. They have a wart on their face or on their neck, and they've been there for years, and the dermatologist even asked them if they wanted to have it removed for years. Oh, no, it doesn't make any difference, it's just there. But then suddenly when they become a grandparent, they often show up to get the wart removed. Why? The grandchild comes up and puts their finger on it and says, "Grandpa, what's that? What is that ugly thing on your face?" in other words. So children have a way of bringing out the truth that everybody else just sort of ignores. It's like the mother of a 5-year-old who was watching Cinderella movie, and daughter decided that she was going to pretend to be the fairy godmother. She got out the little pinwheel she had gotten at the fair, used it as her magic wand, and she told her mom, says, "Make any 3 wishes. As your fairy godmother, I will grant them." Of course, Mom plays along, and first she asks for world peace. And the little girl waves her pinwheel wand and says, "It's done." Then her mom asks for a second, says that all the sick children in the world would be cured instantly. And the little daughter waves her pinwheel and says, "Oh, it's done." And since Mom was a little plump and overweight, her third request was that she would have a trim figure. Well, her little daughter starts waving and waving and waving and waving and waving, and finally she says, "Mom, I don't know. I think I need more power for this one." Children have a way of telling the truth. They get our attention, and sometimes we need to hear the truth spoken. In other words, we become like that widow who was taken in by a shady fly-by-night developer. She calculated that she lost probably $50,000 of her life savings. She finally contacted the Better Business Bureau to file a complaint, and the Bureau representative sort of chastened her a bit. He said, "Well, that sounds kind of fishy. Right from the start, why didn't you come to us before you invested so much money? Didn't you know about our services?" And the lady said, "Oh, yes, I did, but I was afraid that if I called you, you would have told me not to do it." We just shake our heads at such a wrong-headed approach to truth. Yet how many marriages are avoiding painful truths, or business people are turning a blind eye to information that they would rather not receive? How many nice and normal folks live counterfeit lives, never having that level of integrity that would empower them to live as God would have them to live? Truth is elusive and it's essential. But in the spiritual realm particularly, we know that truth is embodied. In fact, Jesus tells us in the passage that we read that the reason that He came was to be that embodiment of truth, that He was the one who came to witness to that truth, and that Jesus is the center of our faith. We as Baptists understand this. In the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message, there's this crucial line talking about the Scriptures, and it says that Jesus Christ is the criterion for interpreting the Scriptures. If you want to understand what God has said, look at Jesus. If you want to understand what God is doing, look at Jesus and follow what Jesus has taught us and what He did there in the page of the New Testament, as well as what He has done and is doing in our lives. Certainly that is so important to understand that Jesus is the one that we look to as the embodiment of our faith. It's like a young Chinese boy who wanted to learn how to be a master jade carver, a jade specialist. And so he found out a famous teacher, and this he went and was able to become a student. And this elderly gentleman, is the very first time they met, he took a piece of jade about the size that would fit in your palm of your hand, and he gave it to the little boy and says, "I want you to hold this in your hand, and I want you to hold it tight. And I don't want you to let go of it until I tell you to." And of course, the little boy grasped the jade in his hand. And at that point, the old man began to talk about everything. Philosophy, men, women, the sun, the weather, almost everything that you can imagine. And after about an hour, he asked for the piece of jade back and sent the young boy home. He came back every day for several weeks, and the same thing happened every day. He gave him a piece of jade. He talked for an hour about everything under the sun that you can possibly imagine, except jade and the jade business. But then one day the boy came and he gave him a piece of green colored stone that was not jade. And as soon as he put it in his hand, the boy said, "That's not jade." And at that point the lesson began, because he would not be fooled by the counterfeit. You know, there are so many ideas in the religious marketplace today, and even within the Christian community there are various versions of truth. But when all is said and done, I think that we all have to come back to what Jesus is talking about here in this passage of the Scripture, to say that when we look for truth, we start that quest by looking at Jesus. If we follow Jesus, we are following the truth. We find ourselves experiencing what we need to understand, because that life that Jesus lived, the things that He taught, the way that He interacted with everyone, it was the embodiment of God's truth. Steve Brown tells the story of a British soldier back during the First World War who lost his heart for the battle, and he deserted. He decided that he would leave the front lines in the middle of the night, and he would sneak back and hopefully find a way to get back on a boat and get back to his native land of England. He ended up sort of wandering around in the pitch night, hopelessly lost, and in the darkness he bumped into what he thought was a signpost. And so it was too dark to even see. The fog was in, so he climbed up the signpost, and he pulled out his cigarette lighter and he lit the lighter so he could see the signpost, to see where he was. And what he realized when he got there was he had not climbed a signpost. He climbed a crucifix that was across the countryside. So when he lit the light there in the dark, he didn't see a signpost. He saw the face of Jesus hanging there on the cross. And then in that moment he remembered the one who had died for him, who had endured the humiliation and the pain of the cross, who had never turned back. And the next morning, that soldier was back in his spot there in the trenches. You know, you and I and all of those around us are looking for signposts to help us determine what is true and what is not true, what is worth giving our lives for and what is not. Truth is elusive and misinformation abounds, and we need to be aware of that. But truth is very essential to the foundation of all that is good. That's why it is worth the search. But in our search, maybe we need to light a match and look in the darkness into the face of Jesus, because He is the embodiment of the truth. He said, "I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. And everyone who is on the side of truth listens to me." I ask you this day, do you know that truth? Have you ever invited Jesus into your heart and into your life? If you have not ever done so, now is the moment to make that decision, to make that commitment. And if you do know Christ, how does it affect your living? Are you living a life filled with the truth that reflects the truth of God's love? If not, would encourage you to use these moments as we stand and sing our closing hymn to respond to the voice of God this day. Our closing hymn is hymn number 581. Number 581, We Have Heard the Joyful Sound. And Reverend Green will be at the front to greet you if you have any need of making any type of public commitment or to join this church. But let's stand together as we sing and use this as our time of response. Hymn number 581, We Have Heard the Joyful Sound.